Today we're going to first watch the central and last part of the film, The Crowd Roars, more or less from where we left it a few minutes after the last frame shown in class on Thursday. It will be about 45 minutes. I will offer a very brief introduction to remind you of what to focus on for this film. I'll invite you also to take notes for yourself because this is one of the 3 films included in the shortlist for the final exam. After the sequence, after the scenes from the movie, of course, if there are any questions or comments, I'll be glad to hear them. Before we leave today, whatever time we have left, I can answer any additional questions about your representation, about the final project, the final exam, etc. before this week's Thanksgiving's break. So The Crowd Roars is quite different from Le Mans. It's still a film about racing, about car racing, about race car drivers. But being produced and shot in 1932, it carries a more moralistic view of racing. First of all, from the outside, the idea in the film is that racing might not be fully moral, fully acceptable for society at large, because if you consider the race car drivers who risk their lives to win and get a monetary prize, it seems like it's not worthy, especially for someone with real talents like Joe, the protagonist. He should be using his talents for a more impactful kind of endeavor that would have a positive impact on society as a whole. From the point of view of the spectators, as the title suggests, The Crowd Roars, it doesn't seem to be fully moral for people to crowd the stands around the racetrack, hoping to get the dramatic excitement of some potentially fatal crash. It looks like the crowd's going to a gladiatorial game. They're craving blood in a way. They want to feel a strong emotion, but that emotion is at the expense of the risks run by the drivers themselves. Racing is also, inside the story, the opportunity to develop a moral story of sin or loss and final redemption through a process of spiritual transformation. From that point of view, we've seen in the first sequence in the film how Joe Greer fails to really execute his roles in a responsible manner. First, we see him failing in spite of his great success at racing. We see him failing in his relationship with Lee, because Lee is now a changed woman, changed from the fun-loving, luxury-loving woman that she was when they met. And she's ready to commit. She's ready for a long-term relationship. She's ready for things that have an actual value, such as meeting his family. And he keeps her away. Joe keeps Lee away. In fact, he's mocking her desire to have a ring placed on her finger. Then we see Joe failing in his role as the older and therefore allegedly the more mature brother to Eddie, who wants to have a chance at a career in racing. Paradoxically, to persuade his younger brother not to jump into this kind of career, Joe raises a series of arguments that apply to himself, that are all unresolved issues and questions that he, as a mature individual, should be dealing with. And in the next sequence, soon after the first scenes we're watching today, we'll see Joe failing at protecting his brother's morality. And how can Joe teach a moral life to a brother who's better because more naive, less jaded, more wholesome than Joe himself? We'll see Joe trying to keep Eddie away from booze and easy women, when in fact, with just limited effort, Eddie will turn Lee's friend Anne into a proper wife. And Anne, in turn, through the kind of support that women as wives are supposed to give their husband, will turn him into a more mature man who stands for himself, his family, because his family is now his wife, and his career. Joe will continue to drink, will continue to take excessive risks, will continue to have limited control over his life and emotions. And in fact, exactly because of his booze and his anger, while trying to pass his brother during a night race at a racetrack in California, he will end up sending his friends and teammates' car off the track to a horrible burning death. After that, Joe will have to go through a period of absolute loss, will end up at the end of the film as a homeless, and he had used the word bum during his speech with Eddie in their father's garage, saying, don't do this, don't enter this kind of career, you might end up as a bum. At the end of the film, Joe is bum, and he is asking for favors, for a job, for a ride on a race car at Indianapolis race. There he will meet Lee, who's now herself a changed woman who has lost the life of luxury that she could enjoy at the beginning of the film. So they'll reunite, enter a different kind of agreement. They'll have to prove each other, especially Joe to Lee, that they have changed sincerely. And after that, at the end of the film, we will see Joe's career also being resurrected with the help of his younger brother. They will both win the race at Indianapolis, taking risks, but being in control of both their risks and the emotional turmoil that has made their lives, especially Joe's life, more difficult. So rather than trying to represent the essence of racing, the film is making racing into a parable about human nature, right? And making the film into a moral tale of sin, loss, and redemption through transformation. Keep these elements in mind as we see the rest of the film, take some notes that might be helpful for your review before the final exam. Of course, if you have any questions or comments, I'll be glad to hear them at the end of the class. For those who entered after I started, after the film is over, there will be time if you have more questions about oral presentations, the final project, the final exam, before we leave for our break. Okay? Do you have any questions or comments about the film? And then after that, we can go back to talking about the presentation, the final project, the final exam, any questions you might have before the break. Okay? So first, the film. Questions and comments about the film we just saw. As I was saying before, during the race, they're using images shot at Indianapolis, including some shot during the actual race, and other scenes were staged at a smaller, different racetrack. And that's why you also see something that looks confusing, because during that time, Indianapolis had bricks on the track, and you see the bricks both in some of the wider shots and also when they stop at the pits. But then there are other scenes where you see a lot of dirt, a lot of dust, and that's the other track, or one of the other tracks where they shot other scenes. No questions, comments, reactions? Okay. It's a nice film for the standards of the era. Great acting, of course. The acting is somewhat emphatic, especially on the part of the women, because that was the style from the silent era up until the 1920s, right? To make the emotions immediately legible on the face, right? Bring them to the surface as much as possible. As I said, the movements of the actors through the various scenes is choreographed in a very theatrical way. They move, assume a position, stay in that position for the delivery of lines, unless a movement or a gesture is required. They don't even move their shoulders. They seem to be very stiff. Everything happens in the face. And of course, the format of the frame itself helps create a central space, a central focus of attention for the faces. Confrontations happen around the middle of the frame where the diagonals from the corners meet. But if you look carefully, there is indeed a choreography of movement. They move in sync through the scenes. When they have to move, it's either one or two of them waiting stiffly while the other makes movements and gestures, or they move in sync, they change their position to rearrange the placement of the bodies within the frame. You have a question?
Actually, I just thought of a comment that I noticed between that film and then with Le Mans, like at the end with both protagonists, there's this idea, notion of perhaps redemption, of redeeming themselves from
Absolutely. Yeah.
The previous actions that they have made that cost the lives of one of the other racers, and then even with like the risks at the end, they still cut through it and they broke through that.
Right.
What I consider like a wolf, like risk that's meant to keep them inside.
And that's absolutely right. And what else makes them similar and aligns them with this theme of redemption is the fact that in both movies, the main protagonists, Joe or Delaney, get a second chance. When their career, in the case of Joe, the race, in the case of Delaney, who crashed in the morning, seems to be over, here they are on a different car, being offered a driver's seat to go on and win the race against all odds, but it's not, they don't bask in the victory. Of course, Delaney doesn't even win the race, gets in second place, but it's something that confirms a change that happened inside of them, so that they don't need the triumph, they don't need the celebration. It's the victory against their demon. It's also a step ahead in their human path, human growth path, right, towards becoming better persons, right? And better also in the way of feeling responsible for other people in their lives. Although, of course, in Le Mans, this is suggested very lightly, somewhat indirectly, and in this film, it's smack in your face, right? That's why this is clearly a moral tale. Nobody can miss the moral lesson, right? He stopped drinking. He became more humble. He controlled his anger. He shows what it means to be responsible for someone else in your life, your woman or wife, your brother, right? What's against the usual standards of the period, quite often in the early 1930s, you would have seen a final scene with a recomposed family, with a recomposed social community. So we might have expected from this kind of film in this era to see also the two couples together, to show the unity within the couple and the solidarity between one couple and the other, that clearly the director wanted to package everything very tightly, and probably the producers insisted on this lighter, more comedic conclusion with the ambulances chasing each other to an emotional reunion at the end, based on love, based on forgiveness, etc. Right? The ending is more economical than some other parts of the film, right? And overall, the film keeps a good pace. Surprisingly, when the same director, Howard Hawks, made a second movie about racing in 1965, that film was not as good or as tight as the previous one, but it showed how much he cared about racing, how racing was an obsession of his, making two films with such a gap, 30 years later, making another film about racing in the 1960s, a film basically about what was then NASCAR, the NASCAR championship, but not worth seeing. I included a link to that film, but not as good as this one. Okay, we have about 5 minutes, maybe a little more, for any questions about exams, presentations, etc. Yes, Emily?
I know for the midterm we kind of had a little list of what readings and videos or movies to mostly focus on. I couldn't find any of that for the final. Are you able to?
Yeah, no, I can add, as I did for the midterm, I can add links to the relevant readings. Won't take me long. And of course, the other thing I'm going to do when I go back to my office, unless anyone shows up to see me during office hours, I'll send out emails to people presenting and in class, and emails to people who, if they haven't scheduled a Zoom presentation, they will need to schedule one. Of course, it doesn't mean that if you already schedule a Zoom presentation, you'll be allowed to present on Zoom. I'll randomize your names and put, as I said, about 12 or 15 people across the two classes of the last week, and the rest of the students will have to present on Zoom. What else? Yes?
So are you going to choose the people who's going to present?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I invited people to volunteer, but I don't remember, I don't think anyone did, so I'll have to pick some people. As I said, Mo suggested that I give extra credit for people presented in class. I don't think it's completely fair, but clearly I'll keep that in mind. I'll keep in mind that presenting in the class is a bit more nerve-wracking, take a little more courage, and be more lenient, of course, for people presented in front of the class. Okay, so I'll definitely take that into consideration when it comes to my assessment. Colin?
If you need people to volunteer, I can do it.
Okay, yeah. Let me know. Send me an email and let me know if you want to present on Tuesday or Thursday.
Okay, sure.
Yes.
For the presentation, should we like prepare some Google slides and share it
Yes.
with you, or
That would be ideal so that we don't waste any time with the transitions. And however, I already made it clear abundantly that your presentation should include things that are actually useful for your audience more than yourself. Meaning, if you're going to comment on a passage, put the passage on the screen. If there is an illustration in your short story, many of them come with illustrations that you want to comment on. Show the illustrations, put their names that you might mention for the characters and their role in the story. And then for yourself, you can keep an index card or two with some ideas that you want to touch upon. Don't come with one of those scripted, heavily scripted PowerPoints where you then proceed to read. I know you can read, hopefully, and what you need to show is that you're able to talk, not to me, but talk to the class, right? Even when you present on Zoom, you're not presenting to me, you're presenting with an ideal target audience. One of the important things is whether or not anyone, myself included, but especially your peers, who hasn't read the same story you're presenting, gets what the story is about and what the role of the automobile is about. Are the characters embracing the technology or rejecting it? What is the impact of the technology of the automobile on their life, whether it be their romantic life, they fall in love, they split, or their social life, right? How they're perceived, what's their public persona at the end of the story, based, positive or negative, based on the events in the story. So don't try to be comprehensive, don't try to include everything because the project will have more, and try to limit the number of ideas, passages, examples that focus on clarity, on the clarity and strength, persuasion of your message to the audience, trying to convey clearly your understanding of this particular story. Okay, so don't try to be too formal. You don't need to start with a formal introduction or at the end of your presentation, summarize your point, right? The summary of the points in the presentation is something you do if your presentation is an hour long. If your presentation is 8 minutes, 10 minutes, then your audience should remember without your help at the end. Okay? And again, if you need to pause at some point to find the next thing that you have to tell your audience, that's not what I'm looking for when I'm trying to assess the quality of your presentation. That's not going, if you need time to collect yourself, your thoughts, find the next thing to say, that's fine. That's not what makes the quality of your presentation. I'm looking at the core ideas and the clarity and how convincing your presentation is, not some kind of preconceived notion of academic formality, right? Okay. And if you celebrate Thanksgiving, happy Thanksgiving.
You said you were going to pick us if people volunteer. For what day will we know what they were doing?
No, I'm going to the office now and I'll send out.
Okay,
emails.
yes,
So I'll put the names in a randomizer,
Where
pick
will
those names, and I'll email everyone
Okay.
either to tell you're on the roster for
Okay.
Tuesday or Thursday, or you didn't make the rosters for the class presentation. If you haven't scheduled,
Okay.
make sure you schedule the presentation on Zoom, and I'll send a link that allows you to pick a date and a time for the Zoom presentation.